Hi folks, welcome to Straight Talk with Sid. Today's episode, I want to deal with the issue of the International Court of Justice that recently found Israel to be plausibly guilty of acts of genocide in Gaza. And I want to also deal with the fallout from those very serious rulings against the state of Israel.
So this is an interim decision, and in a key part of today's decision, the justices rule that it is plausible that genocidal acts could be happening in Gaza before that ruling. So the International Court of Justice says Israel must immediately take a number of steps, 6 emergency measures, to prevent any genocidal acts as the war continues. Here is first reaction from outside the court from a Palestinian representative.
This is a historic day. Palestine welcomes the momentous order by the International Court of Justice. This order means that the court recognized the gravity of the situation and was convinced by South Africa's compelling presentation that was based on law and fact that there are plausible cause to believe that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza.
Astonishing turnaround for a nation who the whole entire act, the Genocide Act, was put in place as a consequence of what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust in the Second World War. For now to find themselves in the dock, credibly charged with that same crime is quite astonishing. But beyond that, it's the fallout from those allegations that I would like to deal with here today. In particular, I'm talking about the day after the international courts found there was a plausible case against the state of Israel. They came out with these allegations that 12 members of UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Agency, had in fact engaged in participated in the attacks on Israel on October the 7th. That these are extremely serious allegations, and it has knocked the story of Israel being found plausibly guilty of genocide, that has knocked that off the front pages of the newspapers around the world. And some folks are saying that was an intentional strategy by Israel to in fact release these allegations the day after the findings of the International Court of Justice.
How do you rationalise the irrational?
I don't know.
I mean, what is happening is that I think Britain is marching to America's tune.
Yes.
I think there is huge pressure from the Israelis. This is all on the front page of the New York Times this morning. And guess what? They leaked it the day after an ICJ decision which found that Israel, there was plausible evidence that Israel was basically a genocide suspect on parole.
It's not a coincidence that the attack on UNRWA happens after the ICJ ruling. So Israel is trying to discredit the International Court of Justice, and one way of doing it is by rubbishing UNRWA. But UNRWA has fulfilled a heroic role since 1948 in providing health and educational and all other services to the Palestinian refugees. And it is really heartbreaking that Israeli propaganda is now demonizing UNRWA and leading some countries to cut off the aid to UNRWA.
In a report yesterday, UNRWA is now saying that those workers were preemptively fired in order to protect the program. This is before an investigation has taken place. UNRWA has actually moved the investigation to the highest levels in the United Nations to conduct an independent investigation into the allegations made by Israel. But they are saying these workers were preemptively fired. In other words, they were fired without due process. And as a union leader, I can assure you that over my 40 years of involvement in the labour movement, I've never heard of a case where an employer fired an employee based on an allegation that had not been investigated.
Is the spokesperson for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. She joins us from Amman. Thank you for being with us on the program today. So UNRWA dismissed 9 employees. Does the organization have evidence that those employees were involved, indeed, in the October 7th attacks?
UNRWA received allegations from the Israeli government, and the Commissioner General of UNRWA deemed that it's in the interest of the 2 million people we're serving in Gaza and in the interest of the continuation of our life-saving and irreplaceable work in Gaza. He deemed it necessary to preemptively dismiss these staff members for the sake of everything else.
Okay, so the 9 employees that were dismissed were preemptively dismissed. To be clear, does that mean you don't, or that you do currently have any evidence in their alleged involvement in the October 7th attacks?
That is correct. They were dismissed upon allegations preemptively, and an investigation is being opened at the UN headquarters in New York. And these now former employees will have the right of recourse in case the findings are in their favor.
Israel has been trying to undermine the UNRWA organization for decades. They see UNRWA as an organization that's responsible for education and amongst many, many other services in the Gaza Strip. But from an education standpoint, Israel believes that UNRWA is keeping alive the right of return of Palestinians. UNRWA teaches, rightfully so, the history of what happened in 1948. And they basically instill in young Palestinians a sense of history, that in fact they do have the right of return. If an occupier comes in and tries to steal your land and steal your home, obviously, no matter where you are in the world, you have the right of return to your property if justice is to prevail. And that's precisely what UNRWA is doing, and Israel strenuously objects to UNRWA teaching in the schools, and they try to say it's hate speech and they're teaching them hatred. No, they're not. They're actually teaching them history that actually occurred in 1948.
UNRWA has also been under pressure because of its role in the debate on the Palestinian right of return. The agency recognizes all Palestinians displaced from 1947 and 1948 and their descendants as refugees, who have demanded to return to their homes, a stance Israel has opposed. Israeli officials argue that dismantling UNRWA would remove the refugee issue from discussions.
UNRWA is an organization that perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem. It also perpetuates the right of return for Palestinian refugees narrative in order to eliminate the state of Israel. Therefore, UNRWA must become a thing of the past.
But the astonishing part of this story is how quickly the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, mainly European nations, certainly Western nations, engaged in the suspension of funding to UNRWA, the organization on the ground in Gaza with 13,000 employees that are actually providing essential services to the people of Gaza, who've been bombarded now for 118 straight days, where there's like 27,000 Palestinians have been killed, I would argue murdered by Israel, where over 70,000 of them have been seriously maimed. While it's been investigated, you've got 15 nations, a big chunk of them have themselves been involved in colonizing and acts of genocide down through the years and down through the generations.
That the ICJ ruled that there is a risk of genocide in Gaza, the Liberals paused funding to UNRWA, which is a lifeline for millions of innocent Palestinians. People will lose their lives. And unbelievably, the conservative leader has accused 30 1,000 UNRWA humanitarian workers of being terrorists. He does not deserve to lead. We support an investigation into the 12 former staff, but defunding UNRWA is collective punishment and it is illegal. When will the Liberals stop abandoning Palestinians?
For millions of Palestinians in Gaza, the primary UN agency UNRWA is simply a lifeline. They depend on it for healthcare, social services, and jobs. Especially now, after months of Israel's war on the territory. But threats of funding cuts could worsen an already dire humanitarian situation. Established in 1949, UNRWA's mission was to provide relief to Palestinians who lost their homes by the creation of the State of Israel. Nearly 6 million Palestinians in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, Syria, and Jordan rely on the aid provided by the UN agency. With approximately 30,000 staff, UNRWA's reduced funding could impact food aid, healthcare, and other critical services across the Middle East.
So to conclude, the astonishing part of this story is how quickly the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, mainly European nations, certainly Western nations, engaged in the suspension of funding to UNRWA, the organization on the ground in Gaza with 13,000 employees that are actually providing essential services to the people of Gaza who've been bombarded now for 118 straight days. And yet, these Western countries decided to suspend their funding to the organization that's on the ground, 13,000 of them, supplying life-saving services to the Palestinians. What sort of lunacy is this? How can it be that a nation like Canada decides to suspend its funding for an organization in the midst of a famine, people being starved to death with disease and bombings on a regular basis, and yet we add to the misery. We add basically collective punishment on top of the collective punishment that Israel is meting out. Now these 15 nations that have suspended their funding, they too are now complicit in this war crime, in this acts of genocide that has taken place in Gaza. You've been listening to Straight Talk with Sid Ryan.